But the Pharisees, having heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together against him, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Good morning. Welcome to a short biblical reflection on the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 up to 40. It is the Gospel reading for the 30th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year A. About the commandment of loving God and neighbor we find in the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 22, Mark chapter 12, and Luke chapter 10. Those two accounts in Matthew and Mark are more similar, though Matthew's account is almost half size only of what Mark writes, while the one in the Lucan Gospel it has completely different setting. In all these three, we have similar persons mentioned. In particular, in Matthew is mentioned a lawyer, in Luke a certain lawyer, while in Mark is one of the scribes. In the Gospel according to Matthew, the first question is about the greatest commandments, while in Mark it is the first of all. But then later on, in conclusion, when Jesus says, this is the great and the first commandment in Matthew, while in Mark there is no other commandment greater than this. So those two concepts of greatest and the first are in use in both Gospels, but of course not in the same order. Both Matthew and Mark quote from the Old Testament, but also making introductions. In particular, Matthew introduces the second part, and a second is like it, while in Mark and Gospel, even there is longer quotation and introduction before the first one. The first one is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That quotation is not in Matthew. And then, of course, comes the commandment of loving God. And the second one is introduced. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Then the whole conclusion in Matthew is shorter. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets, while in Mark it is more extensive. And the scribe said to him, You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other but he. To love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, and with all the strength is to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And yet we have added it by Mark. And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, You are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared to ask him any question. Similar statement we find also in the Lucan Gospel at the end of the statement about the commandments. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. It is both highlighted in that yellow background. While in the Lucan Gospel, the question which is posed is the following: Teacher, what shall I must do to inherit life? And Jesus doesn't answer to this question, but poses two questions. What is written in the law? How do you read it? While in Matthew and Mark, it is Jesus who quotes the commandment of loving God and loving neighbor, but in Lucan Gospel, it is this lawyer who now says it, and there is no any particular introduction between those two commandments. They are all put together. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And then, of course, that whole story in Luke's Gospel is followed by mentioning that this lawyer wanted to justify himself, and therefore Jesus quotes him, gives him the parable of the Good Samaritan. The commandment of loving God and loving neighbor, as it is joined as one in all these three accounts, it comes in fact from two different places of the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament they are never put together. About loving God, we find in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. Let me read already from verse 3. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe them diligently, so that they may go well with you, and so that you may multiply greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. And now the following words in verse 4 are quoted by Mark, but they are not quoted by Matthew. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And then from verse 5, it is included in all these three accounts. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And then we have following explanation. Keep these words that I am commanding to you in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lay down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Why about loving our neighbor, we find in the book of Leviticus chapter 9 verse 18, where there is more extensive, I'm just quoting shorter version, more extensive description of what we should avoid, what we should not do, with then putting emphasis on loving neighbor. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slander among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall not reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But also we can find another line, connection between the gospel reading of today from the gospel according to Matthew, when we have this statement that on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. This is the literal translation of this verb, that they hang. Sometimes it is translated in the sense that they are based on. This verb hanging can now be recalling, binding the law as a sign of those phylacterias on the hand and fixing them as an emblem on your forehead. On one hand, this law has to be so much attached to a person in order that that person would keep that commandment. Otherwise, it will not be so strongly attached, but loosely, can be really lost and not observed, and consequently there will be no coming God's blessing. And therefore, similarly, all other laws and the teaching of the prophets, they just hang on these two commandments, so like suspended. So if they are written, let's imagine, on the tablets, if they will not be properly suspended, hang on these two commandments, then they will fall and break into pieces, and consequently there will be also no God's blessing. I would like to wish you a nice day, a nice reflection on this gospel reading. God bless you.